Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Gregor Schuurman, an ecologist with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program in Fort Collins, Colorado. He's here to talk about the ResistAcceptDirect management paradigm, which is a method that park superintendents and other land managers use to make management decisions in the face of challenges like climate change. The RAD framework, as it's known, was the subject of a recent BioScience special section, which I hope you'll read and enjoy, and you can find links for that in the show notes. It's all free to view, but for right now, let's go straight to the interview. All right, Dr. Schuurman, thank you very much for joining me today.
No, thank you, James. Happy to be here.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about ecosystem management in places like national parks, and we'll be talking about the RAD framework in particular. But before we get into that, I was hoping you could tell us just a little bit, so we'll have a baseline understanding about how management has been performed traditionally.
Yeah, sure. I think when I talk about this, what I'm really trying to convey to people is that we have a RAD framework, but it's just a tool, a very clarifying tool to understand the great challenge, which is a change in the way management is happening. And so to focus on your question, kind of where we all come from, and it's certainly my own upbringing as sort of a middle-aged person. I come out of the late 20th century, and I come out of an understanding of stationarity. It's not the idea that natural systems are static. We had that idea earlier on, but it was a newer understanding, an understanding that nature has dynamics, it has change, but that generally, for the most part, that change operates within familiar bounds, whether it's the drivers of ecological conditions or the ecological conditions themselves. And so knowing the past can help you know what to expect and manage for in the future. That's the idea of stationarity, and that's basically the paradigm that natural resource stewardship and conservation has lived within for the decades in which I've become a scientist of biology and of conservation in my own life.
So, just to throw an example out there, if we were talking about, a national park, say it was, Rocky Mountain National Park, and we have, a certain assemblage of tree species there. And in the stationarity model of thinking of things, we would kind of always seek to have that same basic assemblage of species and assume that was what you would expect to see in that spot.
Exactly. Good example. And so let's say you're in Rocky Mountain National Park or thereabouts, and you're in the subalpine zone, and you're thinking about fire as a structuring process, a natural part of the system. Turns out at that elevation, it's not a very high return interval phenomenon compared with other elevations. But recent work by my colleague Phil Higuera and others shows that the frequency of fire in these systems is way, 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 in the past 2 decades, has leapt way outside of the historical range of variability that he and colleagues have established through paleoecological techniques over 2,000 years. So you have 2,000 years of what you would call historical or natural range of variability, and then the last quarter century, that what we've seen is that those bounds no longer hold. And so if you're asking yourself, what vegetation should be here in the system today or in the future, and you understand that fire is a major driver of ecological potential, you are now outside of as sort of a realm where the past can guide you, literally. And, my colleague Dawn Magnus, who wrote the second paper in our special section, she and colleagues, they have a quote that the viewpoint in the special section picked up that basically says, shifting from historical baselines that are generally observable, knowable, and agreed on to non-stationary conditions that are novel, uncertain, and contested. That's really what we're talking about. And that Rocky Mountain example is a good example. The kind of fire regime that's being contended with really demands different thinking.
Right. So, and it's the kind of thing where if you were trying to, manage to that old model, you'd fail anyway because climate change has just, thrown such a powerful spanner in the works. And likewise, in an area like if it's a low-lying area and you have saltwater encroachment, it's just going to change things, and you can't get away with that old model anymore.
Yeah, and these different examples you're offering, they have their own unique different nuances. The seawater rise, that's a steady change. It's coming. You can track it decade to decade. Doesn't mean it's easy, but you know when that change, you can sort of predict it to a certain degree, whereas these other systems like forests that are primed to change, but they're waiting for that ignition and that event, you can't predict when that will happen. You can just understand with good science, perhaps, sort of nature, the propensity of that change, and that it's primed to change.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. I imagine, talking about the different scenarios that you apply this framework to. But it occurs to me that creates a pretty striking, challenge insofar as if you're going to have a management framework, it has to be one that's willing to or able to adjust to all of those different types of scenarios. And so you've got the RAD framework, which is laid out in the special section. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it differs from older approaches?
Yeah, it's sort of paradoxical because within the adaptation realm, it is actually one of the older approaches. Of course, we're talking a realm of thinking, a field that's about a decade and a half old. So it's young, and it's all different timescales. But let's say what happened is in the early 2000s, some of the leading thinkers about the challenges of the emerging Anthropocene and legacies of human impacts and so on, started grappling as well with climate change and the strong directionality, the pervasiveness of these changes that were happening. And they started first making this point that we have some challenges with our historical paradigm. And a co-author on the opening paper in our special section, David Cole, and others really led this thinking in 2007, 2008. There's a book they edited called Beyond Naturalness, which really just asks the provocative question of when human influence is so pervasive and growing, these reference points of naturalness and historical are just harder and harder to apply. They were beginning to grapple with that. And they made the point then that what we really need to help move conservation, resource stewardship forward is a framework that lays out the choices, that is centered on manager choices, manager intention, manager action, that is simple, where the choices are discrete, a whole lot of clarity. We need to be practical here. And they put out Resist, Accept, Guide. And it was there in the mix, and the mix kept mixing of different frameworks for a number of years. And a person like me came in sort of midway in this evolution of this field. And colleagues of mine and I looked around, and we kind of picked this one back up and said, what we need to do is just maybe make Guide a little stronger. We need to recognize that the kind of intervention to direct ecological trajectories could be quite forceful. And we need to acknowledge that spectrum. And so we changed Guide to Direct. We messed around a little bit with Accept versus Accommodate. I think I'm falling into the weeds here a little bit. But we kind of gelled on Resist, Accept, Direct about 3 or 4 years ago, and we've kind of worked with an expanding circle of partners on it. So that's the history. It's all new compared with the 20th century paradigm. And on the other hand, within the field of climate change adaptation, it's actually been an enduring idea that we've just tweaked a little bit, and now it sort of has its moment.
Okay, so let's go through, just for the sake of definitions, and define each of those terms. I think people will see it laid out as the Resist, Accept, Direct framework. But what do each of those words mean in this kind of context?
Right. It's a very simple framework, and on the other hand, like a lot of simple things, it gets complex very quickly, and the nuances matter.
Should we use the boat analogy?
Yeah, I think the boat analogy is a good one. Let's start with that, and then we'll kind of work our way into the framework.
Okay, cool.
So in the opening paper of our special section, we offer a boat analogy. We worked with an artist a couple of years ago. It was a side project in a large federal group working on this. It was us literally saying, we need to paint some pictures of what we're talking about. We need more than one approach to talk about this complex challenge of transforming systems, and the idea of it's difficult to go back home, so to speak. So in the boat analogy, and now I'm going to try and paint this analogy with words, which is sort of not the point in the first place, but here we go. In the boat analogy, a ship has left port, and in the literal picture we paint, it's sort of a happy, sort of a summer campy kind of environment. It's left port, it's out in the water, and a storm has come up, and the winds are coming pretty much straight line from home port. meaning that you can't sail back there, or at least you're going to be tacking and jibing and difficult. And so this is a change in circumstances. And so the choices that the boat has are perhaps to just pull that sail down and drift with the winds. Perhaps they may carry the boat to a different shore that's an acceptable place to land. Alternatively, they can raise their sails, make use of the sails and the rudder, maybe not get home, but find a preferred alternative than simply drifting. So instead of simply accepting change, that first choice, they're now directing change. They're working with those forces of change, but to go to a new destination. And then finally, perhaps this ship wants to expend resources and have impacts and compromises and pull out a couple of big old motors and burn some fuel and go straight upwind back to home port. And that would be resisting change with different and more powerful tools, again, with some compromises involved relative to what they might have expected they would need to do to keep things the way they were, and in that sense, get the boat back to home port.
Okay, so I think that gives us a good basic understanding of the definition of the terms. How do you apply this in a practical sense? Under what circumstances would you, if you're managing an ecosystem at a national park or whatever land, when would you apply them, and under what kinds of circumstances, and how would you change and revise your thinking and approaches depending on what happened or how things were going?
Yeah, so now we're switching from the analogy to the reality. And so let's quickly ground ourselves in the definitions and what we're focused on. When we think about applying RAD, we recognize that what we are responding to is a trajectory, right? A trajectory of change, to be slightly redundant, in the ecology of a system. And it's not just A to B, it's A to somewhere. And so we focus on the trajectory. It's not just a state change. And we say to ourselves, much like that boat analogy, what might we do to resist change in species, abundance, and therefore ultimately structure, composition, ecosystem function, and from a human perspective, ecosystem service? What might we do to resist a trajectory of change in those attributes of a system? What might the system do if we make a choice to allow it to respond autonomously to non-stationary drivers? And then finally, analogous to the ship with the sails up and using the rudder, how might we steer this change, this trajectory, away from at least preferred potential future conditions? Trying not to be too hubristic about what we can do there. Those are the three choices. So a good example comes out of Acadia National Park in the Northeast, where they are on the boundary of boreal forest to the north of them, and then to the south of them, a northern hardwood forest system. At the same time, like everywhere, there are lots of non-native species that are just waiting for any opportunity to jump in. And the park is concerned because of recent experience and climate projections, and including projections of likely future changes in climate suitability for many of those boreal forest species. They're concerned about an ecological gap opening up here where a climate-related disturbance, perhaps with other aspects of global change, non-native pests, for instance, knocks down those boreal forest elements. And before the northern hardwood elements can either expand in abundance on their own, or some of them move from further south, what they're worried about is these non-natives at the door, which are mostly shrubs and vines, literally converting a boreal forest into an undesirable, from the perspective of stakeholders and managers, sort of Eurasian thicket, not the rambunctious garden they want. And so what they say there, and the way they use RAD framing, is to say, okay, we know what happens if we accept that change, or at least we have enough confidence that we want to think about intervening, which is always something of a bar, especially in the National Park Service, to make a choice to intervene, go through a process. We're disinclined to do that if we can avoid doing so. So in this case, we understand what accepting looks like. We don't find it desirable. And so then you go to the question of how might we intervene, right? Where and how might we resist this change and keep conditions natural/historical. And in this landscape, they recognize that not all parts of the landscape are experiencing climate change at the same rates. There are climate change refugia, places where, because of all kinds of sheltering, let's say north side of a hill or a mountain is going to be cooler and not warm as fast. So you find those opportunities where it's strategic to still resist. And you work like heck there, and you get creative, and you know why you're doing it. And then other parts of the system that are more exposed, or maybe at a larger scale, you can't do that. What you may be able to do is steer that change. And what Acadia is doing is saying, okay, as we lose our boreal spruces or firs, what we're going to be ready to do is help species, like I said, from the south come in. And what they're doing now in preparation for those important decisions with lots of stakeholders and lots of considerations is the basic exploratory research. So they're doing the science to open up that option and then go through a process of deciding. So the short version is they don't want to accept that change. They can resist in some places, but not everywhere. So they have to consider directing and literally managing with the flow.
And so could that mean something like planting, northern hardwoods in Acadia?
Yeah, and they're doing it now. And let me put a huge asterisk on that. They're not doing it now out on the landscape in a applied decision. They're doing it now in the sense of common garden experiments in the park and elsewhere across the state, in that case, with a lot of partners, to basically understand, because it's not straightforward, right? Climate change isn't just an analog to somewhere else. There's some novelty in there too. So there are real questions about which species from a state or two to the south, from Massachusetts, for instance, might actually survive conditions today in terms of both germination and recruitment. And so there's a lot of work going on about that. The other thing, of course, is recognizing if certain species might behave undesirably, maybe do too well. And so we're falling a little bit into the theme of design, which is, again, what directing is about. It's about doing this strategically. It's not carelessness. It's not willy-nilly. It's not opening up decisions to just about anything. It's trying to be strategic and work with, ultimately, non-stationarity. If your park climatically is becoming a northern hardwoods landscape, then practicality demands that you start thinking about working with the ecological flows that are going to result from that.
Okay, and this is probably the closest to a curveball that I'll throw. But I'm curious about values. So with stationarity, we have this model, at least we're trying to go back to something that was an original state or something like that. But, when we're managing for change, it's a little bit different because the ecosystem that you're working towards is something that someone picked. It's reflective of some sort of values. It's reflective of someone's choices. And I'm wondering about how do you decide the ecosystems that you're trying to manage too, and those sorts of outcomes as well?
Yeah, this is a huge topic, and it's one I feel good about because a lot of the work that's happened on this framework and powered these papers comes out of a group called FedNet, which is an assemblage of federal climate change adaptation and resource managers, specialists, who've been working together for the past 3 or 4 years to really hone the application of RAD and really more like wrap their arms around the bigger challenge of managing systems facing transformation. And what we did is we had social scientists in there from the beginning. And so a lot of us use this word values, and you used it a bunch of times in this thing. And what the social scientists did, and I sort of pulled up the one of the key figures from their paper, which is the 4th one in our bundle, led by Katie Clifford. And they said to us, you guys keep using this word values, but let me give you a few others. Beliefs, identity, attitude, sense of place, faith, emotions, norms, larger political economic forces, risk perception, location, landscape change, and so on. And they said there are a lot of words here, and this is a very rich topic. And when you think about values and you think about stakeholders, or especially managers, they've got internal constraints and they've got external constraints. And basically, much like RAD is a nice framework for thinking about stewarding transforming systems, there are additional frameworks one needs to think about how to think about values. And we're very lucky that we've had social scientists in our group all the way along helping us learn, those of us who aren't social scientists, and generally to bring to this work kind of a rich social science perspective. And so I would strongly encourage readers to have a look at the Clifford et al. Paper. And I'm just reminding myself, if I can, what the title is: Responding to Ecological Transformation, Mental Models, External Constraints, and Manager Decision Making. Got a whole paper on it, and it's wonderful.
That's great, and we'll have a link to everything, within the show notes, so people can look up the all the articles in the special section. I had a question which is related, but how does the RAD framework work with, or incorporate, or accommodate Indigenous land management, which is a topic that's been arising more and more frequently lately?
It's a really good topic, and we've had some conversations recently. Acadia National Park actually had a science symposium this fall, where we had some Indigenous voices fairly prominently speaking about transforming systems and, to some degree, the RAD framework. Also, our opening paper in the special section has a box that kind of talks about this, and it makes a few different points that I think are really important. And the first one is that this paradigm shift and this crisis we're talking about is really a crisis of modern Western resource stewardship based on modern scientific perspectives. And we point out that it's not the only land stewardship caretaking approach. And we acknowledge that thus far, and again, facts on the ground have caught up with us a little bit, but at least at the time of this writing, we had mostly been having a federal conversation about federal resource management, and that bringing in Indigenous voices, bringing in municipal voices, state voices, really many other kinds of voices, NGO voices, was a next step, and that we recognize everybody's confronting these same broad challenges of transforming systems outside of bounds. But the philosophical approaches, the cultural approaches, what change means, what accepting change means, all of this could be very, very different. And we certainly welcome Indigenous perspectives on this. And sort of personally, in that Acadia engagement with Indigenous colleagues, I realized heading into it that it felt more comfortable to start with the common challenge, which is transforming systems, and then say, well, those of us who come out of a Western resource management tradition of the late 20th century have been involved in a crisis, and we find this liberating. And whether it's useful beyond, or it's just useful to understand what increasingly federal resource management agencies and partners are starting to think about, I don't know. It remains to be seen.
I'm wondering then, how do you then, kind of roll out a framework like this one? You've got the idea, you have the, the concept, and it's been promulgated through, of course, internal documents. But, how do you get people to actually start doing it and thinking this way?
Okay, so here's how this all ties together. Those of us in adaptation grapple with this challenge at all scales. And a lot of it for me and my colleagues has been at the scale of, we are working with ParkX next week. We are mostly prepared, but you're never prepared enough in adaptation, because things are happening fast enough that you're just having to help move things along and keep up with events, and there's always more you could do. So it's the press of, we've got to work with the park next week. How are we going to help them think creatively in an unbiased way about their options? And we literally grabbed RAD off a shelf and took it out there. So that's one level, is you take it, you work it one park at a time, and you hone your concepts. That's what we brought into the kind of publication we have now. Now the question is how you scale that up. One way that I've been doing it, and partners of mine on these papers, is just getting out this year in concert with this special section and riding this wave, and just, it's neither marketing nor advertising, sharing the word, right? And that's what we've been doing. And we've spoken to several thousand people in a whole lot of webinars this year, because there's an interest, and this is the moment, and we're happy to do that. That's sometimes the easiest way. This is a good opportunity in line with that. But beyond that, and especially within the domain I come from, there's a practical question, right? The NPS manages 80 million acres. How are we moving that management into a RAD framing? And so I got a few answers for you here. One of them is, you seize the moment politically, and this is a moment where the Department of the Interior, perhaps differently than in recent years, is ready to think practically and realistically and forthrightly, if I might say that, about climate change, and that includes climate change adaptation. And so through some work we've done in the past year, the Department of the Interior Climate Action Plan specifically calls out the ResistAcceptDirect framework. It's a small thing, it's one paragraph, but you don't need much at that level. That's how that works. It's there, it's legit. From that, you can tear down and do the same thing on, let's say, the Fish and Wildlife Service Climate Change and Refuges page, which you can Google, and you'll find it's got a picture of a polar bear, and it's heavily RAD-based. It basically threads it through and explains what that looks like. We in the NPS have a RAD page, got a lot of the same information, trying to get the word out. Most practically, though, what matters is training and changing that management culture. And so what we've done is, at the same time we've been working on these publications, we've been working with our partners, particularly the National Wildlife Federation, Bruce Stein and Patty Glick, and we have unified RAD with climate smart adaptation, which is our method of adaptation for natural and cultural resources. And that's a tool that came out in 2014. So at about the time we started honing RAD and applying it, we had sort of received or participated in the formulation of this general approach, sort of an adaptive management approach called Climate Smart. So we've worked with the National Wildlife Federation to bring scenario planning, Climate Smart, and RAD together in a new guide that came out this spring called Planning for a Changing Climate. That's also fairly Googleable, NPS Planning for a Changing Climate. We abbreviate it as P4CC. And that's kind of like the grand unifying theory of climate change adaptation, particularly for natural resources for us. And we're really excited about it. It brings together several tools we're using and says, here's how they reconcile. And we're building training around that right now. That is the next step. Having published out this material is to build training. And the hunger for it across the NPS planning core and management core is really, really high. I think one of the biggest things personally for me is different about the moment today and when I started working for the Park Service 8.5 years ago is that you don't have to make the case anymore to managers that climate change is a thing and they need to think about it. That landscape has changed and it's profound. So we've got a different demand than we had a few years ago, and in that time in between, we've been using our engagements with our early adopters to develop these tools and hone them, and we feel really excited about the way things have progressed, because scaling up is always a challenge, but we actually have the concepts ready and we've test driven them a little bit, and that feels really good.
Yeah, and I think that excitement is something that, I in particular note. I think there's a tendency when we look at issues like climate change to feel as though one is doomed, simply because the scope of change is so great, and sense of loss that one experiences when thinking about certain familiar landscapes and ecosystems is so great. But this seems to offer a way to envision the future that's one that is rich as well and also gratifying.
I had a slide in one of my slide decks where I just say RAD will set you free.
Right.
And I'm not just joking around. I really think it's liberating. And I think Jack Williams's viewpoint piece in this special section does a nice job right in the final paragraph or two of talking about this. And I found it really moving. And I'm not going to quote it. I don't have it right away, but I'll just encourage people to read the viewpoint piece. I thought it was wonderful. And again, it feels good to hear other people get it, resonate what you're thinking, and then take it to the next level. That's what climate change adaptation is right now. It's a really creative realm. I'll give you one example that I think is pretty heartening. The landscape around Los Alamos, New Mexico, that's Bandelier National Monument, and so on, it's a difficult landscape. It's had these fires that we've heard about since the late 90s. These really large fires. One of them burned 100,000 acres, burned hotter than ever before, right? Scorched the ground to where it won't even absorb water, all that kind of stuff. Not everywhere. And so you have a heterogeneous landscape of places that have been hammered and aren't coming back the way they used to. As a consequence of that, you've got these ahistorical floods scouring out your waterways. having all kinds of impacts. It's a tough place. And yet, the managers in that landscape are some of the most inspiring ones in our whole RAD universe in terms of the diverse partnership there. It's dozens of pueblos, all kinds of federal agencies, state agencies, private actors working together, NGOs working together in that landscape. And what they're doing is they're learning how to accept change to a certain degree in some of those transformed landscapes, but they're also learning how to resist strategically and often really creatively, and often because of human values. So, for instance, a lot of Douglas fir got taken out, and they're replanting it, but not everywhere because climate projections suggest that's unwise. But they're finding the places where it is wise, where it is strategic, and they're resisting by replanting there because, among other things, that's a culturally important being, a culturally important species in that landscape. So there is a reason to work hard on resistance and think about it in that way. Also very creatively with resistance in that landscape is that they took advantage of these scouring floods that literally removed the biota from those watercourses. And they said, well, okay, we just got rid of all our non-native fishes. We can now restore a native fish assemblage that we haven't had in several generations. And with, again, some very creative but deliberate and often very intensive resistance, maybe we can prevent these systems from having those floods again because of the way we're managing the upslopes. And just to kind of round things out there, when they're planting some of those other elements, their pinyon juniper, their lodgepole, etc., they're planting those at the margins, they call them, which is just sort of a casual way of saying we're planting them at the uphill end of their historical distributions. When we put these trees back on the landscape, we're moving them up, right? We're moving those growth zones up. And so in any one particular acre, that's a transformation, right? That's change being directed. They're not going back to what used to grow there. They're going forward to what can grow there and what can therefore, right, protect the watershed.
Yeah, this sounds like a very empowering way of managing landscapes for climate change, and I think it also gives us the rare opportunity to close out a conversation in which we talked about climate change on a positive and upbeat note. So, Dr. Schuurman, thank you very much for joining me today.
You're very welcome, James. Stay rad.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.